Everyone, we've been taking a look at post-war art in terms of Picasso's Guernica and Giacometti's The Walking Man, and dealing with a very tense and turbulent time. And I wanted to continue that theme as we examine abstract expressionism, and as they're trying to understand and put into a visual expression the new world that we find ourselves in the aftermath of the war. Something to kind of frame this discussion, that kind of, as we start to come to a close this semester, thinking about connecting the dots and then piecing things together, and thinking about what values of art you have learned, which ones you liked, which ones you think that you might apply to your own art, which ones you might, not. Thinking about kind of bringing these ideas together, right? The values of the Renaissance was to mimic the natural world, that art should represent the way humanity sees the world visually, right? And the better an artist is able to recapture that reality, the better the art is, right? So art is judged by how close it looks to representational, right? What's represented. We see with contemporary art of modernism, art of postmodernism, is just going to be very different from that. John Dewey, in an essay called Art as Experience, said this. He says, past art. And in common conception, the work of art is often identified with a building, book, painting, or statue, and its existence apart from experience. So just stopping there, thinking about that. He says, generally, the past way of thinking about art is that you put it in a museum, you put it in a church, you put it in an office building, and there it stays, but it doesn't really interact with the average person. It doesn't really interact with people anymore. It becomes part of itself, and it can take on a life as its own, right? It starts to exist beyond human experience. And in fact, there can be even books written on a girl with a pearl earring, or Dan Brown wrote about the Da Vinci Code and Mona Lisa, that they can actually take on their own story, their own life. And in that sense, they become disconnected from human experiences, right? He says, when an art product once attains classic status, it somehow becomes isolated from the human conditions under which it was brought into being, and from the consequences it engenders in actual life experience. And so artists are representing the actual world that they live in. They're representing their ideas, their values, their thoughts, their reflections on it. Then it goes into an art museum, and it's kind of apart from us. It kind of takes on a life of its own. And he suggests, that's fine, right? That's generally the way it happens. If you're lucky as an artist, you get your art in a museum. But he says contemporary art is doing something different. Contemporary art is about experience. He says experience is a transformation of interaction into participation and communication. So it's not just about creating something. It's about the process of creating something. It's about connecting with the viewer and having the viewer become a participant within the work. And those are two key elements. And in that sense, contemporary art takes on this ever-evolving, ever-changing kind of feel to it, right? Because what we're going to see as artists in the post-war era, they're going to try to incorporate the viewers more and more, right? Art is thus prefigured in the process of living. Art denotes the process of doing or making, and the expression is emotional and guided by a purpose. And so, in a sense, when we think about ancient Greek art, mainly they put art on pottery, but they used that pottery every day. It was part of their normal day. And so they connected with the art. But what we see happens up until, post-war era, is that art was, the sole purpose was to be bought, to be, purchased by a wealthy patron, or to be put in a museum or a church, and to be sold to be placed in another institution. but it's losing that connection between human beings in a sense, right? That you have to go and visit the museum. And the argument is, how many people are really going to go visit a museum, right? And the overall percentage of the population is not going to be very large. And so the idea is to try to make art about the experience and bringing people together. Again, a very utopian type of vision. How do we change people? How do we change society? How do we direct and lead them? We have to be able to communicate with them. And so art is about experience. Similar to what we see with Duchamp's The Fountain, kind of starting it all, that art is about the experience of thinking about art. It's about the discussion of whether this is art or not. Whether you agree with it's art or whether you agree with it's not art, we're kind of in the middle of a discussion on what makes art art. And that's the experience, right? And so, I mean, I don't know if Duchamp necessarily thought that far ahead and, thought that this was going to change the art world and create a discussion. But in a sense, every art that comes after him kind of grapples with that. It's thinking about how do we make it more immersive? How do we make it more about people thinking and interacting and engaging and talking than just going there and seeing pretty images, right? Let's take a look at abstract expressionism. Abstract expressionism has roots that date back before World War II with Kandinsky's and Picasso's abstract works. These artists asserted that beauty in art should no longer be merely about mirroring the exterior world. And again, this started with Impressionism and it kind of moved towards abstraction with Kandinsky and Pollock. It should be about demonstrating insights that the artists have about the world rather than the visual reality, right? Surrealism also influenced abstract expressionism with its focus on representing inner thoughts, going into the inner mind. Unlike surrealists, though, abstract expressionist art is entirely void of visual reality because the inner world of emotions has no exterior reference. And so whereas surrealism is going in the inner mind, they're painting things like melting clocks or swans reflecting elephants that looks real, right? So the luncheon in fur is a teacup with fur on it. We recognize both of those. But what we see with abstract expressionism is it's not going to have an external reference point. It's going to be very similar to Kandinsky's improvisation number 28, where there is nothing visual about it. It's just creating emotions, and that is it. And I think what abstract expressionists argue is that we think or we feel before we think. We don't really come into this world as children having fully developed sentences. We feel hungry, we feel tired, we feel lonely, whatever the case may be. We have feelings, and it's not until later that we learn how to process the thinking. And so what they're suggesting is that's the natural, that's the primal essence of humanity. So let's focus on what we feel, because what they argue is in the aftermath of Holocaust and World War II, we've lost the ability to feel. We become too analytical. We become too unfeeling. The only way that you can put to death 11 million people is if you don't feel for them anymore, right? And so they're suggesting that we need to find that emotion to lead and direct society, right? Furthermore, they build upon the ideas of Carl Jung, who is a psychoanalyst. And they promotes the idea that within the inner psyche lays universal truth. And that's what Carl Jung argued, that underneath, within us, there's like this blueprint that's called the collective unconscious, something that's common to everyone. Hence, their art is the process to discover truth that is common to everyone. Most of their works are not about the final product per se, but they are more about the act of arriving at the final product and what the art critic Harold Rosenberg calls action painting. So it's about the process. So it's about the experience of creating art rather than the actual art product. And similar to what we've talked about with John Dewey in the previous slide, let's take a look at Jackson Pollock, who's the main abstract expressionist. And, however you feel about him, a lot of people have very strong feelings. And a lot of people don't like his art because they say that a 2-year-old can do it, right? But again, we have to be cautious of that as we take a look at contemporary art. Because, as we've taken a look at with Giacometti, initially, the average person on the street would probably say that's ugly. But once we start learning about it, we can start saying, okay, there's something more to this. And so rather than having the knee-jerk reactions, what I recommend or advise is start thinking about why is an artist choosing to represent his or her ideas in the way that that he or she decides to, right? And so I think that's a better question to think about. Why is the artist choosing to do this rather than that looks like a 2-year-old could do it, right? That's kind of a dismissive attitude, right? So they're going to invite deeper introspection, which is going to take more work on our part, which makes it about that experience between the viewer and the artist. Born in Cody, Wyoming, and moved to New York in 1930 to study painting under Thomas Hart Benton in the Art Students League. As with de Kooning, he worked for the WPA. He discovered alcohol in his 20s and struggled with alcoholism throughout his life. His art can be divided into 2 periods, binges and recovery, right? So he's battled with this throughout his life. On August 10th, 1956, he drove his car off the road, killing himself and one of the 2 women with him. Rather than depicting the outer world, Pollock turned inward to represent his inner mind, suggesting, right, in the aftermath of the Holocaust and atomic bomb, the exterior world has completely failed humanity. The rational mind has completely failed humanity. So we need to focus on the inner mind. He felt that studying the mind could help to uncover truths that generally are hidden from the human eye, very similar to what we see as surrealism. What's underneath the surface? Let's peel back the mask. But the aesthetic's going to look very different. His work center on expressing the human psyche, stressing irrationality of it and anatomical fragments, numbers, and geometric shapes, right? So this is really, abstract expressionism is really the first American avant-garde movement. You have these artists that are coming in from all over in Europe and the world, really, during World War II, escaping persecution, escaping the war, and they start mainly congregating in New York City, and artists start seeing these avant-garde European art movements, and they become inspired by them, right? So Jackson Pollock is one of them. And also we talked about how the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, is giving artists like Jackson Pollock, like Film de Kooning, a stable income, so they don't have to necessarily worry about selling their art. They could just do something new and different, unique. And so then we see New York becoming the center of the art world. I like demonstrating, showing this, because it talks about the process of creating.
Having the canvas on the floor, I feel nearer, more a part of the painting. This way I go walk around it, work from all 4 sides, and be in the painting, similar to the Indian fan fingers of the West. Sometimes I use a brush, but often prefer using a stick. Sometimes I pour the paint straight out of the can. I like to use a dripping fluid paint. I also use sand, broken glass, pebbles, string, nails, or other foreign matter. The method of painting is the natural growth out of a need. I want to express my feelings rather than illustrate them. The technique is just a means of arriving at a statement. When I am painting, I have a general notion as to what I am about. I can control the flow of the paint. There is no accident. Just as there is no beginning and no end. Sometimes I lose a painting, but I have no fear of changes, of destroying the image. Because a painting has a life of its own, I try to let it live.
So it's about really the process of creating, the process of what he's feeling at the time, and dripping the paint on a canvas. It's about expressing feelings rather than illustrating feelings, which is a different kind of mindset, right? So the idea of his technique is just to arrive at a statement. He's discovering, what does it mean to live in this post-world era? What does it mean? How do I make sense of anything? So a lot of it is an inquiry of searching for meaning, searching for understanding, right? There's no beginning, there's no end, as he suggests. And so this is about this open expression, this open search for both him and also the viewer. I want to take a look at the technique that influenced him. This is Navajo sand painting in the West. He comes from the West, and he's looking for different techniques to demonstrate, to arrive at meaning. And so, again, rejecting the Western tradition to find other non-Western traditions in art. So the idea of sand painting is, laying the sand on the ground and then creating an image. So what he does is he takes the canvas, puts it on the ground, and rather than putting sand, he puts the paint on the canvas to create meaning, to create ideas, to create understanding, right? This is one of his most famous works. This one is at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City, called Autumn Rhythm. And again, it's very different from the Renaissance. There's no objects that are being represented. There's no depth. There's only gestures of the hand and colors, and that's it. So as you think about this, I want you to think about, what color do you see first? What one jumps out? Is it the brown? Is it the white? Is it the black? Right? And then which one jumps out second? And then third? Right? He's asking us to kind of slow the pace of our vision. Now, if I was to ask you to paint something that represents the chaos, confusion, the doubts, anxieties, all the world that we see around us, the news that we read every day, and it seems like we're constantly surrounded by ambiguity and uncertainty. What would, if you were to express that artistically, what would that look like? Right? If you're trying to demonstrate your search for trying to find meaning in all of this chaos and confusion, what would that look like? If you wanted to invite the viewer to demonstrate a chaotic world and invite them to find meaning and truth and understanding, if you're trying to demonstrate the randomness, the feeling of randomness and lack of order that feels like it's there sometimes in the universe, what would the painting look like? Right? And so what he's doing here is he's searching for meaning amid the confusion and chaos of the world around him. And then by putting it on display for us, he invites us to think about this and to find our own meaning and truth. I like this picture. This is a picture of a student age girl, probably assigned by her teacher to go to the Museum of Modern Art in New York City for some type of class that she probably has taken, like an art history class or a humanities class. She was assigned to go, and she was pretty bored when she was there. She had her AirPods in, just kind of not really, just looking at the floor and surrounded by some of the greatest art of the 20th century. And yet she had her eyes on the floor, wasn't really paying attention. And all of a sudden she walked past this one. She gets about halfway through and she stops. And then she goes all the way back to where she was and then slowly starts walking towards it. And I like this image because it shows her looking for meaning. Her trying to understand. She's searching. Something about this image stopped her dead in her tracks. And she felt it. A lot of Jackson Pollock, when you look at him in a textbook, or you look at him on a digital image or in a classroom projector, you just like has just blobs of paint on a canvas. But you stand in front of it, you interact with it, it's there, and that's all you see. Something happens, right? Something's happened to this young girl who wasn't expecting this, wasn't even paying attention. This kind of hit her like a cement truck, and she's now searching. She's now questioning, right? It's about the experience. It's about this communication, right? It's about this exchange of searching for meaning in a chaotic and confusing world, right? This one he entitles Cathedral. A lot of them he entitles like, Rhythm or Untitled. Doesn't really give them a lot of titles so that we can find our own meaning. This one's kind of interesting because he does frame it with within a religious context of a cathedral, inviting spirituality, inviting this idea that we've lost spirituality in the world around us, and this is a search for finding it, right? But I like this quote by Jackson Pollock, and I think this summarizes the abstract expressionist movement and every art movement that comes after it. It seems to me the modern painter cannot express this age, the airplane, the atom bomb, the radio, in the old forms of the Renaissance, or of any past culture. Each age finds its own technique. The modern artist, it seems to me, is working expressing an inner world. In other words, expressing the energy, the motion, and other inner forces. And so suggests that we can, try to measure Pollock up to maybe Michelangelo or Caravaggio or something and say, this is not, he's not doing what they're doing, and so therefore it's bad. And Pollock would be like, yeah, I'm not doing what they're doing because I'm not living in their age. So why would I do that? I'm expressing the atomic bomb. I'm expressing planes. I'm expressing radio. I'm expressing the changes of the 20th century. This is what the 20th century is, right? Chaotic, confusing, disordered, right? Feeling random, right? This is the world. And the idea of placing this within the context of a religious idea of a cathedral places it within the idea that this is meant to be a spiritual experience. This is meant to be us kind of looking for our own truth and looking for our own meaning. So sometimes I think we can take a look at Jackson Pollock and say, you know what, he's just being defiant, or he's some type of con artist trying to just throw paint on a canvas. But people like that generally haven't stood in front of a Pollock, and they might not understand what he's looking for is truth in a world that seems chaotic, right? In comparison, right? Just to think about these two works in conjunction, all right? Compare and contrast these two works. Consider the artistic elements as you think about how these works represent different values of the human experience. Here's what I want you to think about. What common desires are illustrated in both of them? And this kind of question pushes you a bit, because we generally don't think of Michelangelo's creation of Adam in connection with abstraction. But there might be similar objectives, a similar search, a similar longing, a similar yearning to find meaning, a similar yearning to connect with the divine within both of them. How do they represent humanity's search for meaning? And then which one do you like better, right? So just some thoughts to think about in terms of Jackson Pollock. Let's take a look at a couple more. They're going to do something very similar, and they're also going to be unique and somewhat different for abstract expressionism. But they all knew each other. They all were living in New York and having their own kind of thoughts, and so reflecting each other and doing their own unique thing. Born in New York in 1905, he was educated by his parents who were Jewish immigrants. He found his love for art as a teen with trips to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, also known as the Met. After graduating from City College in 1927, he worked at his father's garment factory for 2 weeks. He was one of the few artists in New York who was not part of the WPA because he was working as a teacher and couldn't produce the required amount of work, and so he just wasn't part of the program. So he always felt a little bit left out in that regard. As a result, he felt isolated from the art circle. His approach is more rational than Pollock's. Pollock stresses spontaneity. A lot of times Pollock was listening to jazz, and so the spontaneous nature of jazz. But Newman focused on structure. So it's a different approach, although the effect might be somewhat similar, but the approach is different. He sought to capture the sublime, believing that humanity has lost the ability to feel and needs to reconnect spiritually. So Barnett Newman was deeply concerned about the current state of humanity, believing that we've lost our ability to feel the divine. The sublime is the highest state of ecstasy that a human being can feel, right? If you take a look at a lot of definitions of the sublime, it sounds a lot like how we describe the gift of the Holy Ghost, right? And it's this connection, this spiritual connection that feels elating, it feels elevating, it feels as though your mind is enlightened. And he suggests because the world has lost connection with spirituality, with religion, that's why we tend to be angry and violent. But if we maybe can reconnect spiritually, maybe we'll be less violent. And so as art is trying to reconnect spiritually, this is what it looks like. Much more methodical. I mean, you don't see necessarily the brushstrokes. What he does is he mathematically measures out the strips to give it more of a mathematical precision, similar to what we see with Piet Mondrian. And then the zips that he suggests are these aspects of our connection with above, right? With beyond, right? He wants to recreate the sublime to engulf the viewers. He suggests the postmodern world has lost the ability to find the sublime, as Jung had argued, and this leads to a feeling of anger, aggression, and violence. And I want you to think about, does that capture us today? Do you think that there's a lot more anger, aggression, and violence? And could it be because we've lost that ability to feel the sublime or spirituality, right? So vir heroica sublimus, that translates to, that's Latin for man, the hero, and the sublime. This idea of elevating, in a similar way to what we see with Michelangelo's David, teaching us how to elevate our thoughts, to look past ourselves, the mortal part of us, to find the hero within us, and connect with the divine, right? So again, and the question is, well, how do you do that? It's just a lot of red on a canvas, right? But when you're engulfed, when you're standing in front of this is at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. When you're standing in front of this, you feel something. It has an impact. And I can't necessarily explain it to you. You just have to experience it, but it's meant to. What I want you what do I want to impress upon you is that's his ideal, right? Is to capture that essence. And again, to think about the juxtaposition, right? Compare and contrast. What common desires are illustrated in both works in this connection with the sublime or the divine? How do they both represent humanity's desire to connect with spirituality and the divine? And again, which one do you like better? All right, let's take a look at one more abstract expressionist, Mark Rothko, and what he's doing and how he fits in with them, but he also has his own unique voice. He was born in Russia in 1903. His family immigrated to the U.S. when he was 10. His family finally settled in Portland, Oregon, and he attended Yale from 1921 to 1923 on a scholarship, but then he moved to New York, and then he gets involved with the art scene. He essentially taught himself how to paint by attending art shows, becoming familiar with his contemporaries. His first works were visual representations of the sadness and emptiness of the modern urban world, so think maybe Edward Hopper in that regard, that kind of loneliness and isolation. However, in the 1930s, he became influenced by the Surrealist and Jungian theories, the idea of going deep within to find the universal consciousness. He explored the collective unconscious, the ideas that we all share, and he gravitated towards abstract expressionism, and then this is what he creates. Large blocks, very similar to what we see with Piet Mondrian. Very simple colors, a simple flatness, right? But I like this, what he says. I like a couple of his quotes. I think they're pretty powerful. He says, a painting is not a picture of an experience, but it is the experience. And I think that's the big difference between a lot of art that we've studied in the past, from previous centuries. It's about representing the experience, but what they're trying to do is give you the experience. So as you stand in front of it, you feel something. You feel what he's trying to get, right? Because we all feel the same thing. And I think a lot of times people stand in front of an abstract expressionist work where they're afraid that when they do, they're not going to feel the right thing. Is there a right or wrong way to feel? And the answer is no, right? Not necessarily. But I will say this, you will feel something, right? He says, you've got sadness in you, I've got sadness in me, and my works are places where the two sadnesses can meet. And therefore, both of us need to feel less sad, right? This idea of connection. Can we connect as human beings? Can an artist connect with a viewer? Right? How do we do that? That's a good question, right? A good thing to think about. He says, I'm not an abstractionist. I'm not interested in the relationship of form, of color or form or anything else. That's not really what he's about. I'm interested only in expressing basic human emotions. Tragedy, ecstasy, doom, right? So he's like, I'm not really about trying to just put paint on a canvas. I'm about trying to create an experience, an emotion for the viewer. And if you are moved only by the color relationships, then you miss the point. The point is not to think, okay, what's the white, kind of white bluish line? How does it interact with the yellow? How does it interact with the red, right? Notice I'm not really analyzing it in that way. It's about standing in front of it and just feeling what you feel, right? Just taking a look at one more, right? Just briefly here. He says, the people who weep before my pictures are having the same religious experience I had when I painted them. I once had a student who took my class, and we were taking a look at abstract expressionists and Rothkos. And then she happened to go on the Europe trip that I helped lead that year. And we went to the Tate Modern Gallery in London. And there's a couple of Rothkos in the Tate Modern in London. And, she was I was kind of walking in and just kind of talking with some students, and I saw her kind of linger. And I just kind of let her be. And I just continued on and went through the Tate. And she came back after going to the Tate, and she said, I stood in front of that for an hour. And she says, I cried the whole time, right? There was something that happened. And I know it's hard. It's hard to believe when you're just seeing a digital image, right? He says this, I want to eliminate all obstacles between the painter and the idea, and between the idea and the observer, by removing such things as history, memory, geometry. It's not about imposing ideas. It's just about connection. Can we just connect as human beings and not have the clouded ideology of conservatism, liberalism, Republicans, Democrats, all of those things that cloud us? Can we just connect on a basic level as human beings without that? Because those ideologies tend to separate us, and they create this tension of us versus them. And that creates tragedy. That creates problems, right? So let's eliminate all and just connect. He says, and this is kind of interesting, this is, if anyone starts to criticize abstract expressionism, this is something that you can, quote them, right? This is something you can tell them. For while the authority of the doctor or plumber is never questioned, everyone deems himself a good judge and an adequate arbiter of what a work of art should be and how it should be done. Everyone's an art critic. But does that make them truly an art critic? Does that make them really know what's going on? Does that make them truly informed about the art world and why works of art stand out? Why certain works of art are in a museum and still studied, right? Again, just to compare two works, compare and contrast these two works. What common ideas are shared in both works? How do they express human emotions and our desire to unite? Again, which one do you like better? All right. That covers our discussion of abstract expressionism. Next time, we're going to take a look at pop art and how we see pop artists are responding to abstract expressionism. This was quite avant-garde, quite new, quite radical at the time. But then again, like Impressionism, it becomes popular, and once it becomes popular, you have artists that are seeking to do something unique and different.